It's been 38 years since Spaceballs warped our sense of sci-fi comedy. But while the movie left us laughing, the real lives of its cast were filled with battles far darker than parody. From tragic deaths and health crises to heartbreaking personal struggles, what really happened to the stars you thought you knew? Let's find out. John Candy as Barf. Barf wasn't just a sidekick, he was the beating heart of Spaceballs. Half man, half dog, and always loyal, John Candy filled the screen with warmth and clumsy charm. His timing, his grin, and that wagging tail made Barf more than a parody. He became the soul of the film, a reminder that kindness could shine even in the middle of chaos. Candy's real life, though, was far from lighthearted. He grew up fatherless after losing his dad to a sudden heart attack, and from a young age carried the shadow of hereditary heart disease. Hollywood saw his large frame as a joke, typecasting him again and again as the funny fat guy. Even in celebrated films like Uncle Buck and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, Candy privately battled humiliation and loneliness, never quite escaping the pain of being boxed into roles that mirrored his insecurities. By the 1980s, Candy turned to alcohol and cocaine to cope with the pressure. The drugs gave him quick energy, but the cost was devastating. He collapsed more than once, rushed to hospitals in the middle of shooting schedules. Doctors warned him his heart was dangerously weak, but the industry machine didn't stop. He kept performing, delivering laughs in Splash and Stripes, even as his body was quietly breaking down. Family was his only anchor. On the night before his death in 1994, he phoned his 2 children in tears, telling them he loved them, as if he knew what was coming. The next day, he died of a heart attack in Mexico at only 43, leaving behind debts, unfinished films, and a shattered family. His final release, Wagons East, was dedicated to him, a bittersweet farewell to a man who gave joy while suffering silently. John Candy played Barf in Spaceballs 1987 when he was 37 years old. He passed away in 1994 at just 43, with an estimated net worth of $15 million, proof that even a giant of comedy couldn't outrun the private battles that haunted him. Mel Brooks as President Scroob and Yogurt. When you think of Spaceballs, you can't miss Mel Brooks stealing the show twice over. As President Scroob, he was a selfish, bumbling leader more worried about comfort than responsibility. Then, as Yogurt, he flipped into a wise and very short mentor who introduced us to the legendary Schwartz. His ability to mock both the villains and the heroes made the parody unforgettable. Early in his career, Brooks was scraping by, writing jokes for others while living in a 4th-floor walk-up apartment in Greenwich Village, making what little money he could from freelance work. He was fired from gigs, ridiculed for trying to break into television and film. One screenplay, Marriage is a Dirty, Rotten Fraud, reflecting his own marriage, was rejected so many times that he wondered if he would ever get credit for being more than a funny sidekick. When The Producers, 1967, finally came, Brooks made something daring. A satire about Nazis, about greed, about moral bankruptcy, and studios hesitated, fearing backlash. The film got mixed reviews at first. Siblings in Hollywood whispered it was in bad taste. But then it won him acclaim, including an Oscar for Best Original Screenplay. The triumph was sweet, but the months of self-doubt before release were bitter. Not every gamble worked. The 12 Chairs, 1970, was a personal passion project, but audiences barely noticed, and Brooks carried the sting of that disappointment for years. Later, Life Stinks, 1991, a film he directed, wrote, and starred in, became another painful reminder of how unforgiving Hollywood could be. It was a box office failure, and for Brooks, it felt like giving a piece of himself to the world only to have it thrown back. Those moments left scars he couldn't easily laugh away. Mel Brooks played President Scroob and Yogurt in Spaceballs 1987, when he was 61 years old. In 2025, he is 99 years old, still revered, though his health is fragile. and his net worth is estimated around $100 million, a fortune built on laughs, courage, and many nights of fear that the next film might be his last chance. Rick Moranis as Dark Helmet. Dark Helmet was supposed to be terrifying, but Rick Moranis turned him into comedy gold. With his tiny stature hidden under a ridiculously oversized helmet, he played the villain as a spoiled child, throwing tantrums and stumbling through battles. His performance gave Spaceballs its most quotable, laugh-out-loud moments and made Dark Helmet a cult favorite. But Moranis' story took a tragic turn. In 1991, at the height of his career after Ghostbusters and Honey, I Shrunk the Kids, his wife Ann Belsky died suddenly from ovarian cancer at just 37. She had been his grounding force, a gifted costume designer who kept him balanced amid the madness of fame. Her death shattered him, leaving him with 2 young children and a grief too heavy to hide. Hollywood was calling, offering him major sequels and Disney blockbusters, but Moranis quietly walked away. He turned down Ghostbusters' 2 promotions, refused new roles, and vanished from the spotlight. In rare interviews, he admitted he couldn't imagine acting without Anne by his side. His choice shocked the industry. Few stars at his level had ever left voluntarily, but he decided that fatherhood was more important than fame. The years after were lonely and quiet. Moranis kept a low profile in New York, occasionally doing voice work to pay the bills, but never stepping fully back onto the screen. Depression and self-isolation lingered, even as fans begged for his return. Only decades later did he agree to small projects, but his absence had already written him into legend, the comic genius who gave it all up for love and family. Rick Moranis played Dark Helmet in Spaceballs, 1987, when he was 34 years old. In 2025, he is 72, living a private life away from Hollywood, with an estimated net worth of $10 million, a fortune built on hits, but a legacy defined by sacrifice and loss. Dick Van Patten as King Roland. Comedy was in his smile, but behind the laughter, Dick Van Patten carried a crown that weighed heavier than it looked. As King Roland, he delivered every line with a twinkle of silliness, embodying the goofy monarch of Druidia with ease. The role may have been lighthearted, but Van Patten himself knew how dark show business could get. Van Patten's life behind the camera was often painful. Pushed into show business at just 7 years old, he never had a real childhood. By his teens, he was rebelling with alcohol and gambling, addictions that clung to him for decades. In 1950, his drinking spiraled so far that he was arrested for drunk driving, a public humiliation that haunted him long after. Television gave him a breakthrough with 8 is Enough, but the role of a loving father clashed with the chaos of his private life. His first marriage collapsed in the 1960s, leaving him deeply depressed and at one point suicidal. Friends recalled nights when he contemplated ending it all, consumed by regret and loneliness, even while the public adored his wholesome image on screen. Health struggles added to the weight. Diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in the 1970s, he fought the disease for decades. By 2010, complications forced the amputation of a leg, confining him to a wheelchair. For a man once known as Hollywood's cheerful dad, the years of decline were heartbreaking. Nights spent in pain, wrestling with both physical loss and the ghosts of his reckless youth. Dick Van Patten played King Roland in Spaceballs, 1987, when he was 59 years old. He died in 2015 at age 86 from complications of diabetes, leaving behind an estate valued at about $5 million and a legacy remembered as much for endurance as for laughter. Bill Pullman as Lone Star. He wasn't Hollywood's first choice, but he became the unlikely hero audiences rooted for. Bill Pullman stepped into Spaceballs as Lone Star, the broke pilot with a Winnebago for a spaceship and just enough nerve to take on Dark Helmet. He didn't play him as a swaggering Han Solo copy, but as a man who stumbled, doubted, and somehow still came out on top. That underdog energy made Lone Star unforgettable. Yet Pullman's rise was anything but smooth. Before Hollywood noticed him, he nearly gave up acting altogether after early stage plays collapsed financially, leaving him broke and questioning his future. Coming from a modest farm family with 6 siblings, he wasn't handed opportunities. He carved them out, one grueling theater audition at a time. In 1990, a devastating car accident nearly ended everything. He suffered a head injury that left him temporarily blind in one eye. For months, Pullman feared permanent vision loss. Acting, something that required both presence and precision, suddenly seemed impossible. The trauma forced him to retrain himself, learning to use his body differently on stage and screen while quietly battling fear every time he stepped in front of a camera. Even at home, stability wasn't guaranteed. Married to dancer Tamara Hurwitz since 1987, Pullman admitted that raising 3 children under the glare of Hollywood brought constant anxiety. To keep up with the workload, he drowned himself in caffeine, which spiraled into insomnia and panic attacks. He worked through the pain, appearing in films like While You Were Sleeping and Independence Day, but every success came at the cost of silent personal battles. Bill Pullman played Lone Star in Spaceballs, 1987, when he was 34 years old. In 2025, he is 71, still active on screen with projects like the 2024 miniseries Fallout, and his net worth is estimated at $20 million, a testament to resilience forged through hardship. George Weiner as Colonel Sanders. Colonel Sanders was the perfect parody of the clueless military henchman. George Weiner played him as obedient to Dark Helmet but constantly flustered, a man terrified of mistakes, yet doomed to make them anyway. His straight-faced delivery made the absurdity around him even funnier, proving that even side characters could shine in Mel Brooks's universe. Weiner's career, however, wasn't without shadows. Born into a Jewish immigrant family, he faced anti-Semitic prejudice during his years at Syracuse University. The mocking and exclusion scarred him, feeding a social anxiety that made his early auditions agonizing. At times, he turned down promising opportunities simply because he couldn't summon the confidence to walk into the room. By the late 1980s and early 90s, Weiner was working steadily in shows like Hill Street Blues and guest spots on Star Trek. But behind the scenes, his heavy dependence on caffeine and cigarettes nearly destroyed him. In 1990, during a television shoot, he collapsed from a severe asthma attack brought on by smoking, a near-death scare that forced him to reevaluate his lifestyle. For a man who wanted nothing more than to work quietly, the health crisis was a brutal wake-up call. Even family life carried struggles. Married since 1972, he watched one of his daughters fall into depression after trying to enter Hollywood, a pain that left him questioning whether his own path had cursed his children. Though he found stability in small theater projects and Jewish community work, Weiner often admitted privately that he lived with guilt about dragging his family into the industry's orbit. George Weiner played Colonel Sanders in Spaceballs, 1987, when he was 42 years old. In 2025, he is 79, still appearing in guest roles on shows like The Orville and Brooklyn Nine-Nine, with an estimated net worth of $2 million, proof of a steady but quietly difficult journey in Hollywood. Michael Winslow as the radar technician. He barely appeared, but Michael Winslow didn't need more than a few seconds to steal the show. As the radar technician, he filled the room with bleeps and bloops only his voice could create. It was pure Winslow, turning a tiny role into a moment nobody forgets. But behind the laughter was a boy who grew up in isolation. Teased mercilessly for his strange ability to mimic sounds, Winslow hid from the world, creating entire soundscapes just to cope. Even after breaking through with Police Academy, he was often dismissed as a novelty act, struggling to be respected as more than the sound effects guy. His deepest tragedy came in 1997, when his son Kellen died by suicide at just 29. The loss shattered him. Winslow withdrew from the stage, haunted by guilt and depression. sometimes wondering aloud in interviews if he could have saved his boy. It took years of therapy before he could step in front of a microphone again without breaking down. The collapse of his marriage in 2002 made things worse. A painful custody battle left him estranged from his children for a time, feeding a spiral of anxiety and drinking. Slowly, Winslow turned that grief into fuel, using his act to raise awareness for suicide prevention, performing on small stages to remind audiences that laughter can heal. Michael Winslow played the radar technician in Spaceballs, 1987, when he was 29 years old. In 2025, he is 66, still performing on tour with his trademark sound comedy, with an estimated net worth of $1.5 million. Laureen Yarnell as Dot Matrix. Dot Matrix was Spaceballs' golden-voiced robot, a parody of C-3PO with sass and spunk. While Joan Rivers gave the character her unforgettable voice, Laureen Yarnell performed the physical role inside the metallic suit. A trained mime, she used sharp movements and comic timing to bring Dot to life, turning what could have been a stiff costume into a lively, scene-stealing character. But Yarnell's own life was marked by heartbreak. Her greatest fame came as part of the mime duo Shields and Yarnell, where her chemistry with then-husband Robert Shields made them TV sensations in the 1970s. Yet behind the curtain, their marriage was unraveling under the weight of constant performing. By 1981, the duo split both on stage and in real life, leaving Laureen devastated and battling alcohol dependency as she tried to navigate life alone. Though she found occasional work on shows like The Wild Wild West and films such as Spaceballs, her career never returned to the heights of her mime days. Feeling adrift, Yarnell moved to Norway in 1998 with her third husband, hoping for a fresh start. Instead, she found cultural isolation. Far from Hollywood, far from the mime world that had defined her, she struggled with loneliness and bouts of depression. Her final years were quieter, but no less fragile. She taught dance and mime to small groups, always giving more of herself than her body could afford. In 2010, while watching television with her husband, she suffered a sudden aneurysm. Within seconds, she was gone, leaving behind stunned loved ones and a legacy that felt painfully unfinished. Laureen Yarnell played the physical role of Dot Matrix in Spaceballs, 1987, when she was 43 years old. She died in 2010 at the age of 66 from a brain aneurysm with an estate valued at about $1 million, a reminder of how fleeting and fragile the life of a performer can be. John Hurt as himself. John Hurt's cameo was quick but unforgettable. In a brilliant twist, he relived his chestburster scene from Alien. Only this time, he played it for laughs. It was dark, shocking, and hilarious, proving Hurt could laugh at his own legacy. His path to that legacy was brutal. Raised by a strict clergyman father who disapproved of acting, Hurt had to pay his own way through drama school by working menial jobs. Those years of poverty left him fragile and depressed, scars that never fully healed even as he rose to stardom. Fame brought no peace. His marriage to Annette Robertson collapsed after only 8 weeks, and later relationships ended in bitter divorces and custody battles. As he gained acclaim in The Elephant Man and Alien, he drowned his stress in alcohol and cigarettes, smoking up to 40 a day, habits that eroded his health and made him appear older than his years. The final battle came with pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in 2015. Even as the disease drained him, Hurt refused to stop working. He filmed Jackie and voiced the dragon in Merlin while gaunt and in pain, determined to act until the very end. Colleagues described him as both inspiring and heartbreaking, an artist burning himself out for his craft. John Hurt appeared as himself in Spaceballs, 1987, when he was 47 years old. He died in 2017 at 77, with an estate valued at $30 million and a body of work that remains as haunting as the pain he carried off-screen. Sal Viscuso as the radio operator. The radio operator in Spaceballs didn't have much screen time, but Sal Viscuso's crisp delivery gave the chaos of the film a touch of military seriousness. He played it straight, which only made the absurdity around him land harder. It was the kind of role he specialized in, small, precise, and surprisingly memorable. Off-screen, Viscuso battled demons that nearly destroyed him. He began drinking heavily in his 20s under the pressure of college theater life. Alcohol followed him into Hollywood, and by the mid-1980s, it had spiraled out of control. In 1985, he was arrested for drunk driving, an incident that threatened to end his career altogether. His personal life mirrored the chaos. A divorce in 1975 cost him custody of his child, and the loneliness that followed pushed him deeper into drinking. Though he built a steady career with shows like Soap and voice roles in Batman, the animated series, the shadow of addiction never fully left him. The death of a close co-star from Soap in 1990 sent him into another depression, one that nearly silenced his career for good. Viscuso eventually turned things around by joining a 12-step program, using humor to talk about his struggles. By opening up on podcasts and supporting recovery charities, he found a way to turn shame into healing. His story became less about failure and more about resilience. Sal Viscuso played the radio operator in Spaceballs, 1987, when he was 39 years old. In 2025, he is 76, still lending his voice to animated projects with an estimated net worth of $2 million, proof that survival can be its own kind of success. Daphne Zuniga as Princess Vespa. Princess Vespa wasn't your average damsel in distress. Daphne Zuniga gave her sharp wit, diva-like tantrums, and just enough vulnerability to make the spoiled princess strangely relatable. She brought sass to every line, turning Vespa into more than just a parody. She made her a character audiences loved to root for. But Zuniga's own journey wasn't so glamorous. In 1990, she was rushed into emergency surgery for chronic appendicitis, sidelining her for half a year. The lost work nearly bankrupted her at a time when she was just beginning to build momentum in Hollywood. For an actress fighting to break through, the forced pause felt like a career-ending blow. She also faced an industry that tried to pigeonhole her. With her Guatemalan-American background, she was constantly offered stereotypical, spicy Latina roles. Zuniga pushed back, turning down projects that objectified her, even when it meant losing money and visibility. Her refusal to compromise made landing serious parts harder, though it eventually paid off with respected roles in Melrose Place and One Tree Hill. Her personal life carried its own struggles. Failed relationships and the challenges of being a single mother in the 2000s left her battling postpartum depression. Even her environmental activism drew backlash. She once received threats after criticizing oil companies. Yet Zuniga turned pain into purpose, throwing herself into advocacy and using her platform to fight for causes bigger than herself. Daphne Zuniga played Princess Vespa in Spaceballs, 1987, when she was 25 years old. In 2025, she is 62, still acting in television while dedicating time to environmental campaigns with an estimated net worth of $3 million. Ronnie Graham as the minister. The wedding scene in Spaceballs wouldn't have been complete without the bumbling minister. Ronnie Graham gave the role a silly stiffness that made the parody of Sacred Vows land perfectly. His comic timing turned a small part into a memorable punchline, a classic Brooks-style gag. But Graham's life off-stage was far from lighthearted. Born into poverty, he watched his mother die by suicide when he was just 16, a wound that haunted him for the rest of his life. That grief pushed him toward performing, but also toward gambling, a vice that followed him throughout his career. By the 1940s and 50s, he was writing and performing in Broadway musicals and even scripting for Sid Caesar, yet his addictions drained every paycheck. Bankruptcy struck twice, the second time in 1970 when he was forced to sell his home just to pay off debts. Behind the laughter, Graham was a man constantly at war with himself. His personal life brought little refuge. His only marriage collapsed under the strain of financial stress and obsessive work habits. By the 1990s, he was living alone. Plagued by heart problems, he long refused to treat out of fear of surgery. When he finally agreed, the operation failed, cutting short a career that deserved far more recognition. Ronnie Graham played the minister in Spaceballs, 1987, when he was 68 years old. He died in 1999 at 79 from complications after heart surgery, leaving behind an estate of about $1 million and a bittersweet legacy as a brilliant comic writer who never found lasting peace. Leslie Beavis as Commander Lorraine. Commander Lorraine wasn't just eye candy. She was sharp, stylish, and every bit the parody of the cold, intimidating officer. Leslie Beavis delivered the role with a mix of glamour and authority, turning what could have been a background part into a striking presence on screen. Her confidence made the joke land, and fans remembered her long after the credits rolled. But Beavis's life before acting was scarred by pain. As a young model in Europe during the mid-1970s, she endured abuse from a manager who exploited her vulnerability. The trauma left her deeply depressed, forcing her to step away from work for nearly 2 years. By the time she transitioned into acting, she carried both ambition and invisible wounds that shaped her performances. Her personal life brought more turmoil. Her first marriage fell apart in 1985, crumbling under the pressure of constant auditions and long filming schedules. In the mid-1990s, tragedy struck again. A car accident left her with a broken leg and months out of work. In an industry where opportunities vanish quickly, the forced hiatus nearly ended her career. Even when she returned, she fought stage anxiety that sometimes turned into full-blown panic attacks on set. Though she appeared in popular shows like Night Court and Star Trek, Deep Space Nine, the struggle to stay calm under the spotlight never truly left her. Becoming a single mother only added to the weight, but she transformed that pressure into resilience, later devoting herself to teaching and helping survivors of abuse. Leslie Beavis played Commander Lorraine in Spaceballs, 1987, when she was 33 years old. In 2025, she is 71, living quietly with an estimated net worth of $1 million, dedicating her life to coaching young actors and advocating for victims of abuse. Jim J. Bullock as Prince Valium. Prince Valium was a gag in human form, nodding off at the altar, the perfect parody of a lifeless royal fiancé. Jim J. Bullock leaned into the absurdity, giving audiences a sleepy performance that made the joke land every time. It was a small role, but his goofy charm made it stick. Off-screen, Bullock's battles were anything but funny. In 1985, just as he was gaining fame on Too Close for Comfort, he was diagnosed HIV positive. At a time when Hollywood was merciless toward anyone with AIDS, he hid his illness in constant fear that the truth would end his career overnight. Drugs became his crutch. Methamphetamine use escalated through the late 80s, compounded by grief after losing his first partner to AIDS in 1987. Bankrupted by medical bills and consumed by despair, he nearly ended his own life in 1990. The man who made others laugh was, in private, drowning in pain. Coming out in 1978 had already cost him his family. He was rejected, briefly homeless, and left to rebuild his life alone. But somehow through recovery programs and LGBTQ+ activism, Bullock clawed his way back. By the 2000s, he embraced his story, using it to inspire others battling the same demons. Jim J. Bullock played Prince Valium in Spaceballs, 1987, when he was 32 years old. In 2025, he is 70, still appearing on comedy shows and living openly as a proud survivor, with a net worth estimated at $2 million. So after 38 years, the Spaceballs cast has faced triumphs, heartbreaks, and tragedies no one could have predicted. Which story surprised you the most? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more untold Hollywood stories.